So about a month or two ago, I did a video on a game called Worldbox, a sandbox survival that allows you to create your own world and fill it with autonomous inhabitants, of which you can intervene in their lives as little or as much as you want by spawning natural disasters, changing the terrain, starting wars or brokering peace, and then some. In that video, I took the challenge to leave all of the inhabitants of the world to their own devices for 24 real-life hours, with the end result being orcs taking over the entire continent and forming one giant unified kingdom, before eventually turning on each other and entering a massive never-ending civil war. Ultimately, it was pretty boring after the first couple of hours. A lot of you guys were quick to point out in the comments section that the orcs are the most powerful race in the game, so this time, I wanted to start from scratch and repeat the challenge and do it all again without the orcs. Let's get into it. So the last time I started off by generating a completely random world and just changing it up a bit to add a few different biomes, but this time I went with a different approach and created the world completely from scratch, choosing to give each of the 3 starting races their own island, where they would have a sort of grace period to get started building their empires without the threat of being killed off early like what happened in the last video. Though I wanted to be sure everyone survived for at least a little bit in the beginning, this wouldn't be a Worldbox video without conflict, so I sort of planted the seeds for war by adding in a large landmass to the northeast, rich with resources that every race could access fairly easily. I also enabled same race wars, so I have no idea what's going to happen here. Only time will tell. I started off civilization by placing humans on the island to the southwest, dwarves on the central islands, and elves to the far northeast. Right off the bat, our mini-societies began expanding. The humans sought to dominate the plains, the dwarves explored their island forests, while the elves separated themselves from one another, forming 3 separate kingdoms where they wasted no time and immediately made a small boat with which they would sail the ocean. While the elves lived in peaceful but separate city-states, the dwarves seemed intent on taking up all the space on their island, drastically increasing their population and erecting small villages with a large central structure that seemed to serve as some kind of capital for their people. Taking a look at the human kingdom of Luchak, it seemed that they too were doing quite well for themselves, establishing 2 towns each with their own docks and ships. As of yet, both the elves and the human naval forces seemed content on just surveying their own borders rather than conquest or exploring far-off lands. Unlike last time, it seems that in a world without orcs and with a little bit more space between the races, the land of Worldbox was starting off being much more peaceful, at least so far. As time went on, we see the humans expanding eastward into their island's great forest, while the elves continued their peaceful coexistence by sending trade ships along the coast, boosting both their economy and culture. All the while, the Dwarven kingdom, known as the Miners of Ramal, continued to breed, making it hands down the most populous kingdom in the world as of yet. Each race seemed content on their own lands, with the only thing of note happening being a large skull appearing in the middle of the elven kingdoms, perhaps foreshadowing events to come. As the Age of Sun came to a close, the Age of Dark was upon us, and with it came some unfortunate events for the Dwarven people. While the rest of the world remained at peace, a rogue mage named Giviwaza would reveal himself a traitor as he assassinated the king of the dwarves, known as Von Agor. He would wreak havoc on the central part of the Dwarven island, burning down houses and trees, killing many civilians. In the midst of the chaos, the town guard could do little to stop the mage. Their village was in flames around them, and all who tried to get near the evil mage were struck down with balls of fire. That's when an unlikely ally came to the rescue. It turns out the island's local monkey populace didn't take kindly to Giviwaza setting the forest alight, and making all that racket waking them from their slumber. So they did what any logical being would do when faced with an apocalyptic scenario. They threw poop at him. The mage was strong, though, and continued to set fire to the village, but the monkey's throws were far too accurate and their fecal matter far too numerous. After some time, the rogue mage was covered from head to toe in simian excrement. He was wounded, and stinky. Eventually the smell was too much for him, and he keeled over and died, and the Dwarven kingdom of Ramal was at peace once again. As the dwarves rebuilt, many began to question the motives behind the rogue mage's rampage. Suddenly, whispers of strange ships on the northern horizon began to be heard in the dark halls of taverns, and tales of evil sorcerers and witches began to take hold. The elven island had been discovered, and the dwarves, seeking someone to blame for their island's troubles, saw fit to blame the small elven kingdom of the Elune Keepers. The dwarven population was booming, still the largest kingdom in the world despite its recent tragedy. Its people cried for war. They had had enough of the strange elvish people's supposed demonic rituals, and they set out for revenge and conquest. While the dwarves braced for conflict, the humans lived an oddly peaceful existence. Establishing a large farm and building more modern-looking houses, the human kingdom of Luchak was at peace and living in what was seemingly its own little utopia. On the other side of the world, the Elune keepers in other elven kingdoms, unaware of the dwarves' intentions, continued about their lives, building massive farms and going about their daily routines. Aside from a few kings suffering some sort of existential crisis and stepping down from the throne, the elves were few in number but still doing well for themselves. Back over on the Dwarven island, the population seemed to lose interest in conquest against the elves, as, despite not a single battle being fought, the war was formally declared over before it even started by King Von Kior, and the land of Worldbox was once again at peace. As the Age of Dark reached its midpoint around year 100, the world was mostly the same as it started. No territorial borders had been changed, populations kept rising, and the landmass to the northwest was uninhabited, as it had been for the last 100 or so years. I have to say, so far it's been interesting to see how with no orcs the world has turned out completely different than before. By this time last video, I'm pretty sure all of the other races were already extinct. I guess only time will tell what will happen when our different civilizations meet one another. Despite ending their last war of conquest before it started, the Dwarven people once again declared war on the elven Elune keepers. At this point, the dwarves are starting to remind me of North Korea. Isolationist, constantly threatening everyone, but never actually doing anything. But who knows? Maybe this will finally be the time where some actual fighting starts. As the Dark Age came to a close, it was at this time the Age of Despair would begin, and a massive icy storm swept the landscape all over the world, freezing many in their place. This seemed especially detrimental to the elves, as both the Eos of Earth and the Elune Keepers' kingdoms were destroyed when the frozen winter killed half of their population, and another rogue mage, this time by the name of Letahaza, came to finish them off. As a result of this, the wars against the elves were once again declared to be over, as 2 of the 3 elven kingdoms were now destroyed. On the other side of the world, the Luchak humans built massive ships and were the first to discover and colonize the northern landmass. They would also send an expeditionary ship to the Elven Islands in the Far East. At home, however, things weren't going so well for them, as a horde of ice monsters killed several of their kings and destroyed a large part of their original village. The last elven kingdom of Onenora was not without suffering, as they too had to deal with hordes of ice creatures that hunted down and killed the majority of their starting village, causing their king to flee into the forest. The dwarves too, it seemed, were dealing with their own ice problem. However, due to a large and well-armed populace, they seemed to fare much better when it came to dealing with the frozen menace. Back on the Elven Isle, the last of the great fire pits was destroyed, and the last remaining citizens of Onenora, who were mostly children, were chased off into the woods by the ice beasts, and hunted down, rendering the elven race extinct, making them 2-time champions for dying first in my videos. They lasted a lot longer than they did last time, and the entire time they existed, they lived lives of peace and prosperity. However, they were simply too weak to survive in the land of Worldbox. Their island is now just a frozen landscape of ruins, twisted trees, and emptiness. Perhaps another race will take it over sometime in the future. Back at the Luchak colony on the northern landmass, things weren't going so well, with the ice monsters once again killing the human king and decimating entire settlements. The inhabitants of the world began to refer to these monsters as the Cold Ones, as they wreaked icy destruction and terror across their lands. Several villages were destroyed while others were cut off from one another, and the once prospering human kingdom became fractured and isolated. The main city and cradle of human civilization of Gomdron was destroyed, as was the very first colony city of Ikwovo. This left the Luchak kingdom relegated to only 3 ships, where all were treading water between the old and new islands. Despite the fact that they could have theoretically potentially taken what was left of the human kingdom and started fresh, it seemed that the humans on board the ships came to face some kind of existential dread, as one by one each ship exploded, killing everybody aboard. Perhaps it was some sort of seppuku, or perhaps a mutiny out of control. Whatever it was, we will never know, as human civilization was now destroyed, and the human race, like the elves, had gone extinct, leaving only the dwarves to claim what was left of this frozen world. Living up to its name, with 2 of the 3 races on the world extinct, the Age of Despair was only halfway over. While the dwarves were faring much better than the other races, that's not to say they were without struggle. They had at this point lost about 1/4 of their population, with fires igniting on their farms and much of their southern villages destroyed. Their population was still dropping, and the entire southeastern portion of their once thriving island was deserted. However, despite all this hardship, it seemed that in the 108th year, things were finally starting to stabilize. The population began to increase, the Dwarven army rallied, and the Cold Ones seemed to be being pushed out of the island and killed one by one. Over the rest of the Age of Despair, another rogue mage would appear, though this time without the aid of the poop-flinging monkeys due to the cold, the dwarves would suffer at the mage's hands much more. Many buildings on the western part of the island would be burnt to a crisp, and the longtime king Von Kior would be killed in the chaos. While the western island burned, tensions too flared in the halls of the miners of Ramal capital, where with the absence of the elves as a common foe, the different settlements argued over law, resources, and territory. The dwarves of the southeast blamed the central and western dwarves for their cities being destroyed by the Cold Ones, while they blamed their eastern neighbors for allegedly conjuring up the Cold Ones in the first place. In reality, no one knew what was going on, but it no longer mattered to the parties involved. Swords were drawn, and war was waged. The miners of Ramal split into two kingdoms, with the rebelling kingdoms flying a lightish red banner and taking to calling themselves the Rocky Thor Iam. Initially, it looked like a sure victory for the Loyalists, with their superior numbers and firestaff technology. However, a resurgency of Cold Ones in the west would force them to fight a war on two fronts, where for a time they were evenly matched by the rebels. As the Age of Despair marched on, between the Cold One invasion in the west and the rebels attacking from the east, the miners of Ramal would be no more. The once largest nation in the world that held people together through most of the Age of Despair would perish. The dwarf island was now half under the control of the Rocky Thor Iam, with the other half dominated by Cold Ones. The rest of the world was peaceful, with no civilization for the Cold Ones to raid, and no wars, disease, mages, or anything else. It was just peaceful snow and forests, left undisturbed for years. As the seemingly never-ending winter trudged on, the rogue mage that had destroyed the west made his way north and destroyed the former capital and rebel stronghold, greatly reducing the numbers of the new Dwarven kingdom. Just when it looked like civilization itself was about to collapse, the Age of Despair came to a sudden conclusion, and the Age of Sun began. With the Age of Sun beginning, the snow began to melt and the Cold Ones began to die off, but that wasn't the end of the trouble for the dwarves. With the newfound heat, fires began to break out, and the last remaining village of Dwarven civilization was razed. From the ashes, some sort of fire monsters began to rise, and they attacked the last of the inhabitants and the remaining Cold Ones. It was literally a war of fire and ice, and the dwarves were caught up in the middle of it. Ultimately, the last of the dwarves would be hunted down and destroyed, their former cities left charred and broken, the world devoid of any civilized life. With this, the challenge was over. What was supposed to be another 24 hours of Worldbox making civilization turned into a roughly 2.5-hour rise and fall of civilization. Well, that's the end of the challenge. It failed this time. What's strange is that this world didn't at all play out the way I was expecting it to. I expected all of the races to colonize the northern landmass and eventually fight it over in a massive world war. They never did. In fact, the vast majority of that landmass stayed completely unexplored by anyone. There was not a single foreign war outside of the initial wars declared by the dwarves against the elves, but like I said, they never actually fought any battles or even met the elves until the elves started their downfall. At that point, I suspected that maybe the dwarves might form some kind of superstate that would fall into a global civil war, kind of like the orcs did in the last video, or maybe the humans would completely take over the northern landmass and they would become a new superpower. But in the end, none of that happened, and I'm glad to see that Worldbox as a game has a lot more depth than I initially thought. It's not just the same formulaic outcomes every time, and that's really something to be appreciated. So, for all the commenters that requested I do a similar video to my last one, just without the orcs, thank you. This was certainly interesting, and to all of you who have made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. Leave a like if you ended up enjoying this, and subscribe for more. I think I might do a sequel on this world at some point in the future. Thank you again for watching, and as always, have a great day, and stay safe. Goodbye.